Okay, I'm back. I was going to try to pretend that I didn't bring the book with me, but then I thought we're already like a little crazy from being quarantined, and I didn't want Nana or Elsie or anybody else throwing things and breaking stuff. So I did bring Listen for the Whippoorwill home, and I have another books. I have some other books too if we need to keep reading some more, but we are on chapter 12, The Freedom Train. Oh yeah, and a new setting. I figured like a nice little reading nook. Yeah, this is what would be my reading nook when I get it all set up one day, but almost there. So, okay, anyway, back to the story. Chapter 12, The Freedom Train. "Where are thy shoes, young lady?" questioned Thomas Garrett gravely when Rosalie joined the others for breakfast in a small secret room at the back of Garrett's shoe shop. Rosalie looked down at her bare feet and shook her head. "I got my first pair on issue day, the day I ran away, but they pinched my toes and I didn't think I could run very far." Garrett chuckled. "Well, let's see what we can do for thee. Stockings would help." Sure enough, after breakfast, the old gentleman brought a pair of stockings and a pair of shoes for Rosalie to try on. They felt funny, but the leather was soft and the shoes laced firmly up to her ankles. "Wear them around the house. Thee will get used to them. And thee will need shoes up north in the winter," said Mr. Garrett. The kindly gentleman also gave new shoes from his shop to the other runaways, whose old shoes were falling apart from the long trek through the woods and water. Rosalie was glad to be back with Harriet and the others, even the sour-faced Charles Walker. They hid all day in Garrett's secret room, and that evening he came and outlined the plan for the next day. "Philadelphia is only 20 miles across the border, but it is probably the most dangerous part of thy trip," he told them. "I have arranged for a bricklayer who is sympathetic to our cause to drive thee into Philadelphia, but thee must go in daytime just like any other load of bricks." Even Harriet looked puzzled. "The bricklayer has built a false floor in the bottom of the wagon. That is where thee will lie. The wagon will be loaded with bricks. No slave catcher wants to unload a wagon full of bricks. It is a trick we have used before, and it has worked well, although not very comfortable for the passengers, I admit. As for the baby, Harriet, does thee have thy—" Harriet held up the brown bottle from her pocket. "Good," said Garrett. "Thee will need to keep the baby quiet until thee gets to Philadelphia. There, William Still, a free black man with the Vigilance Committee, is expecting thee." "Will we be free then?" asked Rosalie eagerly. "Yes and no. Pennsylvania is a free state, but under the accursed fugitive slave law." Garrett's forehead knitted angrily. "A slave catcher can follow a runaway slave into a free state and still drag him back to his former master. I urge thee all to keep going." "But where?" several voices chorused. "To Canada." Rosalie would never forget the ride from Wilmington to Philadelphia under the load of bricks. Before sunup the next morning, they all lay down head to toe in the bottom of the bricklayer's wagon, and a false floor was laid over them. Rosalie could hear the thump, thump, thump as the heavy bricks were stacked on top. She wanted to scream. It felt like being buried alive. But Harriet patted her comfortingly. "Shh, shh, it'll be all right, child. Say the prayer." "Oh, Lord, I'm going to hold steady onto you, and you've got to see me through." The wagon rattled and shook mile after mile. Every now and then they heard the driver say, "Whoa," and voices would demand to know what kind of load he carried. But one look at the bricks and they were always waved on. Late that afternoon, the wagon was unloaded in the heart of the city of Philadelphia, behind a brick building that housed the Vigilance Committee, a group of black and white abolitionists whose sole purpose was to help runaway slaves. William Still, the secretary, ushered the weary group into the committee's office and took down all their names in a record book. He was the first black man Rosalie had ever seen wearing a suit, starched white shirt, and tie. "Rosalie Jackson," Rosalie said when it was her turn to give her name. Harriet and the others looked at her in surprise. "My name is Rosalie. I am free," the girl said firmly. At that, everyone broke into grins and cheers. "You got that right, young lady," said Mr. Still. "Now we are going to try to keep you that way." To Rosalie's amazement, they were given train tickets and transported the next day in two buggies to the Philadelphia train station. There they climbed into a real passenger coach and sat in real seats at the back of the train car with several other black folks. As Mr. Still handed Harriet a large hamper of food, he said, "You better lie low for a while, Harriet. They've got a price on your head now." The small woman nodded. "I know, but it ain't ever stopped me before, and it ain't going to stop me now. I still got family back in the Tidewater Flats, especially my Pappy Ben and my mammy old Rit. I want them to die free." Mr. Still shrugged as if he knew it was useless to argue and got off the train just as the whistle blew. Rosalie couldn't get over riding in an actual train behind a real steam engine. "Is this the real Underground Railroad?" she asked Harriet curiously. "No, Rosalie," Harriet smiled. "If you have money for a ticket, anyone can ride this train." As the miles clicked away outside the train windows, Rosalie realized she was going farther and farther from home. She heard the conductor call out the names of the stations: Allentown, Scranton, Binghamton. "We're in New York State now," Harriet told her. Rosalie held baby Toby up to the window, pointing out the cows and horses grazing in bright October sunlight. As she watched, whole forests of trees march past, all gold and red and yellow and green, a tight lump formed in her throat. How would she ever find her Pappy now? She was going so far away. And how would her brother ever find her? She wanted to be free. She didn't ever want to be a slave again, but would she ever see her family? The steam engine pulling their train chugged through the countryside all that day and all through the night. The hard benches were uncomfortable, but snuggled against Mary's shoulder, Rosalie somehow fell asleep, jolted awake from time to time when the train pulled into yet another station. "Rosalie, Rosalie, wake up!" Mary was shaking her. "If you're going to have a big name like Rosalie," her friend complained good-naturedly, pushing Rosalie's head off her lap, "you're going to have to sleep on your own. My leg is asleep." Rosalie stretched. Sunlight was pouring into the train windows, and passengers were getting their bags together. "We're coming into Niagara," Harriet informed them. "This is where we get off." When the weary travelers got off the train, Rosalie could hear an immense roar. She wanted to ask what it was, but Harriet was already heading out of the train station and down the street. The others hustled to keep up. Between the neat wooden buildings lining the street, a ladies' dress shop, hotel, saddle shop, and blacksmith, Rosalie caught glimpses of a big gorge with trees on the other side, and the roar was getting louder. Harriet turned at a break in the buildings and walked toward the sound. As they turned another corner, Rosalie saw a sight she had never dreamed of in her whole life. In front of them stood a deep gorge. To their left, a river poured over a wide, steep cliff into the gorge in a massive waterfall, thundering loudly and sending a cloud of white spray into the air. But beyond the first waterfall, another arm of the river was pouring into the gorge, 3 times larger and shaped like a big horseshoe. The roar was deafening. "Niagara Falls!" Harriet shouted over the thundering sound. "That's Ontario, Canada, on the other side. And freedom!" The little group stood in speechless wonder for several minutes before Harriet hurried them on. They followed the road along the gorge away from the falls, walking about 2 miles north until they came to a bridge over the river. "The Niagara River flows north from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario and finally into the ocean," Harriet explained, as the little group stood staring at the narrow expansion bridge hanging over the deepest part of the gorge. The water was far below. Since the bridge was only 1 lane wide, the little group had to wait their turn while a farmer's wagon rumbled across from the other side. In spite of herself, Rosebud's knees shook at the thought of walking over the deep chasm on that wobbly bridge. "William Still gave us papers to help us get into Canada," Harriet assured the others as they waited. They were standing off to the side, hoping to not attract attention. Rosalie didn't say much. Freedom, real freedom, lay just across the river on the other side. The slave catchers couldn't take a runaway slave back from Canada. William Still had told them that Canada didn't have to obey the fugitive slave law. Finally, it was their turn to cross the bridge. Harriet gave them each a coin donated by the Vigilance Committee back in Philadelphia to pay the bridge toll. Dutifully, Rosalie paid her toll and stepped onto the bridge. She did not dare look down, but halfway across, Rosalie stopped and stared back at the United States, the country where she had been born and raised a slave. Goodbye. Goodbye to slavery. But at the same time, Rosalie felt sad. Somehow the thought of freedom didn't feel so wonderful without her family. As they stepped off the bridge on the other side, Rosalie held back a little behind Harriet, Charles, Mary, Tobias, Sally, and little Toby. Their journey was over, but what would they do now? Rosalie waited numbly while a customs agent checked their papers that Harriet handed him. Then suddenly she heard her name. Rosebud! Rosebud Jackson! Her head jerked up. Who was calling her name? She saw a black man running toward her, dodging people who were milling about with bags and boxes. The man looked familiar, big and square and handsome. Pappy! She screamed. And the next moment she was being caught up into Abe Jackson's strong arms and kissed all over her face. Rosalie could hardly breathe for happiness. Over Pappy's shoulder she saw Harriet Tubman laughing. Harriet had known all the time, known that she was bringing her home to her Pappy. Oh, baby, Abe murmured as he finally set her down. I've been watching the bridge for days, knowing you were coming. Miss Tubman said she would bring you, and she did. She did. And he caught her up again in a big bear hug. Pappy, Rosalie whispered in his ear, I've got something to tell you. My name isn't Rosebud anymore. I am Rosalie, and I am free. The end. That's the end of our book, Listen for the Whippoorwill by David Netta Jackson. I hope you really enjoyed that. Like I said, I've got other books, so I'll probably break out another one or two, however long we're still here dealing with this. So there she is, my problem person. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys later. Bye.